what is the moral thing to do in terms of the West's support for Ukraine?
To help the Ukraine to defend itself, but not to give food for the illusion that the Ukraine could win over a nuclear superpower.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 139 for the 26th of July, 2022. During the 1980s and 1990s, it cost up to 44 pence per minute to make a call from a landline in Ireland to a landline in Britain. I'm going to give you a minute to absorb just how huge that cost was compared to today. 44 pence, that's 56 cents in new money, 56 cents per minute. At the time, you could have bought 2 ice creams for that. That would cost you about €2 now. So in terms of purchasing power, that 44 pence per minute could easily be translated into €4 per minute now. And Britain was the cheapest international destination to call. Everywhere else was much more expensive. In the early 1980s, British Telecom had been privatised and competition was being brought in first for businesses and then for home phones, and prices were dropping sharply. The same was happening right across the Western world. In one 18-month period at the same time, Eircom, as it was, increased their prices 3 separate times in 18 months. Just think about how crucifying those costs were for any business trying to export, not to mention to families of people who had emigrated, counting out the seconds that they could afford to talk to their loved ones. It was nearly 20 years before Ireland caught up and allowed competition. Eircom had their finger stuck in the dike, but the floodwaters of competition were lapping even closer. At some point, one enterprising business set up a service whereby people in Ireland could dial a Newry number, relatively cheap to call but across the border and outside the control of Eircom, and then dial an account number, and then dial a password, and then dial an international number into an automated system and call internationally much cheaper. Eircom responded to this glimmer of competition by reprogramming their entire network to block calls to this Newry number and started a game of cat and mouse whereby the service tried to switch to new access numbers faster than Eircom could block them. If any private business behaved like this now, they would be lucky to avoid the worst of publicity on Twitter and Liveline and could well be prosecuted under the Competition Act. And now, calling landlines in Britain or most of the rest of the world is functionally free. I was reminded of this when I heard the kerfuffle about AIB's plans, hastily scrapped, to make 70 of their branches cash-free. You could go in to get a mortgage, apply for a loan or whatever, but not withdraw or deposit actual notes or coins. AIB, in case you've forgotten, is 64% owned by the state. It's a nationalised business. Banking, like telecoms, is a pretty highly regulated sector. It sort of has to be, as we found out to our cost in the Great Crash. But the problem with nationalised businesses that are also state-regulated is that the state has a conflict of interests. The purpose of the regulation is to make sure that the consumers are protected, that the regulated business doesn't rip them off, and that the business doesn't do dodgy things such as lend huge amounts to high-risk clients and make the whole system go bust. That's a tension between the business and the regulator. The business wants to screw the customer for every cent they can. The regulator, theoretically, wants to make sure prices are fair. The people running the business may want to take massive gambles because they will be rewarded if the risks pay off, and if the risks go bad, the directors aren't too worried because it's the shareholders' money, not theirs, that is lost. The regulator is there to make sure that the market is stable. But when the state who run the regulator are also the owners of the business, they are sitting on both sides of the table. In particular, the government has a duty to make sure that consumers aren't ripped off, but they have a temptation to soft pedal that if it means that the extra profits the business makes goes to them. For example, Irish mortgage interest rates are much higher than many other countries in the Eurozone, despite the fact that base interest rates are identical. The government could create a regulatory environment that would encourage, say, German banks to set up an operation to lend to Irish homebuyers. The advantage would be that it would save Irish people huge amounts of money. But the disadvantage is that that would save Irish people huge amounts of money. Money which goes into AIB profits and then to the state. Also, remember that the workers in a nationalised industry are likely to oppose anything that might cost them their job, and could well oppose anything that even changes the routine that they're used to. The benefits of reforming any given industry are usually thinly spread around the whole population, but the cost of that reform is often focused sharply on the workers in that industry, who can be highly organised and highly motivated to resist those reforms. So necessary reforms can be delayed for years and decades, not because most people are against them, they aren't, but just because the tiny number of people opposed to the reforms are better organised at putting pressure on politicians. That's exactly what happened with the ERCOM unions, who successfully resisted reform for decades, knowing that politicians were too cowardly to face them down. There is another disadvantage with this conflict of interests. It's notable that in Ireland, evictions, repossessions for non-payment of mortgages, are incredibly rare. There are cases winding through the courts of repossession of homes where no meaningful payments have been made on the mortgage for 15 years or more. In some cases, almost from the day the mortgage was taken out. When the government owns the banks, it's inevitable that they will lean on those banks so as not to create the politically toxic image of them being chased around by reporters asking them why don't they intervene to prevent this or that family from being thrown out on the side of the road. The effect of this is obvious. A certain cohort of people will live for years, sometimes decades of their lives, defying the bank to evict them. That's not the case with all defaulters. Some people have good intentions but fall on hard times, but it's certainly there, and it costs the bank a huge amount, and that cost is passed on to the higher mortgage rates that many of the rest of us have to pay. That, along with the cost of all the other inefficiencies, is not small. The average interest rate for Irish people taking out a new mortgage is 2.77%. The Eurozone average is 1.59%, and the average cost in Germany is 1.16%. So to try and make those figures more meaningful, that means when you start paying your mortgage, and it's typically mostly interest you're paying at that point, for every €1,000 of interest that a German borrower is paying each month, you are paying that same €1,000, and on top of it, you're paying an extra €1,388 that the German borrower doesn't have to pay. A business just can't be a business if every decision they take has to be run past the minister, who has to run it past the local TD to see if it might cost him his seat and cost the government their majority in the next election. And a decision just like that was the one by AIB to eliminate cash services at 70 branches. Almost all retail banking is done online these days. That's a huge efficiency, and it's blindingly obvious that if, when we get a bill, we don't go down to the local bank and get the crumpled up bill that's been in our pocket for a week and count out the payment in notes and coins and get the bill stamped as paid, if we automate the whole thing, that means it costs everyone less. The reason it costs everyone less is because we don't need to pay bank staff to stand in the branch all day counting in those notes and coins, and we don't need to pay the rent on a lot of those branches. The bottom line is we don't need nearly as many people in retail banking because of the advance in technology, for exactly the same reason that we don't need as many people working in VHS tape factories or printing telephone books or making lead for petrol or making petrol engines at all for that matter. That means some people's jobs must change. And if you're against that in principle, then we can all go back to being medieval peasants scraping a living out of the dirt. The figures that I've seen suggest that we will eventually need about 1/5 of the retail banking network that we needed before everything went online. Across the EU, the number of bank branches is falling by about 6% a year. So when I saw a headline on thejournal.ie which said, "Politicians declare victory for people power after AIB U-turn on withdrawing cash services," I felt, well, it's best to not say how I felt. I'll just read you the opening paragraphs of the story. After unleashing a flood of anger from customers and politicians, AIB announced today that it was reversing its decision to remove cash services from 70 of its branches across the country, prompting a slew of TDs to declare a victory for people power. The swift U-turn came following an intercession from Taoiseach Micheál Martin, and as 3 TDs from the Rural Independent Group, Matty McGrath, Michael Collins and Danny Healy-Rae, were in the bank's Dublin City headquarters demanding a meeting with its CEO Colin Hunt. The 3 rural representatives had pledged to stay in the plush Molesworth Street offices until they had secured a meeting with senior management. They were therefore in prime position to declare a victory to the media waiting outside when the AIB announcement came through. The 3 stooges, McGrath, Collins and Healy-Rae, are people who are not normally associated with supporting sit-ins and protests. I didn't see them supporting the Debenhams workers. I didn't see them in any protests against the war in Ukraine, and I certainly didn't hear a peep out of them when billions of taxpayers' money was being hosed away in the bank guarantee. Probably best not to say what I think of them running to catch a headline on this nonsense protest. This podcast is being released on Tuesday. Why? Well, we have 2 interviews this week, and I thought it would be a bit much to put them both in one podcast. So one today and one on Thursday to cover both sides of a debate that isn't really happening in Ireland, but is active particularly in Germany. Not surprisingly, given its history, sending weapons to support Ukraine in its war to defend itself against the Russian invasion arouses bad memories. There are a few voices in Germany, like in Ireland, that may claim they don't support Putin, but clearly support giving him everything he wants, lifting sanctions on Russia, putting an arms embargo on Ukraine. They are mostly on the far right and the far left, or the portion of the far left that is getting increasingly difficult to distinguish from the far right. But there are also a few more reasoned voices that are saying that the smart thing to do would be to do a deal with Putin. We'll be hearing on Thursday from someone who believes that democracy in Ukraine must be defended to the last, because if we don't, we'll be next. In a moment, I'll be talking to someone who advocates, I'm not quite sure, I'll let him speak for himself. But first, I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. It's not the same league as some of the other Irish podcasters that I could mention. It pays for things like web hosting. Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. But it's a great morale booster. When we get a new patron on Patreon, it lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free if you want, but if you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a 1980s phone call to Britain once or twice a month, There's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, we have Julian Nida-Rümelin. He is a professor of political theory at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich in Germany. And previously, he was a Minister for State for Culture and Media under Gerhard Schröder's government in Germany. And the reason I'm talking to you today, Julian, is because you signed a letter which was published in a very prestigious German newspaper, Die Zeit, which was under the headline and was signed by many other German intellectuals. And it was under the headline, and I'll expose my bad German pronunciation here, Waffenstillstand jetzt, which translates as ceasefire now regarding Ukraine. Can you tell me what the letter said?
Well, the main message of the letter is that we have to think about the strategy we follow if we, Western countries, help Ukraine in this war. Mm-hmm. So in the first phase of the war, it was obvious that it was quite important that Ukraine does not lose this war within some days, and Putin can reach his war goals, probably regime change, establishing some kind of government that is pro-Russian, occupy the whole of the country, Kiev at the start, and so on. So one can say in the meantime that most of the probable goals that Putin follows, he doesn't reach. So it's obvious, or at least very probable, that there will not be regime change in the Ukraine, that it is impossible, or let's hope that it's impossible to occupy the whole country. So now we have to think about what is the goal of helping the Ukraine in this war. Is the goal victory of the Ukraine against Russia? And this is a main point of discussion. I think we have to discuss that. One question is, or one goal is not to allow Putin to win the war. Mm-hmm. But the other question is, do we have the goal that the Ukraine wins this war against Russia? And there we are very skeptical. And not only we, almost all military experts are extremely skeptical that it will be possible, also if only with conventional means, to reconquer, for example, Crimea or the regions in the east, the separatist regions in the east, that probably then Russia would react with an escalation. If this happened, it would result in an escalation. So there is a technical term, this is escalation dominance. So probably Russia has an escalation dominance. So wherever we are, Russia can escalate. For example, till now there was no general mobilization in Russia. It is a general mobilization in Ukraine. So this could happen, and even using nuclear weapons could happen. So we don't know how this then ends, but the idea that we have the goal as Western countries that Ukraine wins this war and Russia, as the second big nuclear power in the world, would lose the war is probably extremely unrealistic and extremely dangerous. And this is the background of this open letter.
Mm-hmm. So you're advocating what?
That we as Western countries have to do everything we can to get both parties of this conflict to a ceasefire and then have negotiations. So there was one decision by the Security Council of the United Nations telling that the General Secretary of the United Nations should be involved. And Russia agreed to that. So I would say this is probably one hope, that under the leading role of the United Nations, the occupied parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea could be, by referenda or whatever, be resolved in one way or the other, ceasefire, and then beginning negotiations. That should be the main goal of Western countries. Also, if you look to the situation, world economy, the situation in the global south, where we have millions, probably millions of dead people by hunger and starving. So it's really dangerous if this war continues for months and months.
Okay, your article was about 1,000 words long. Andrei Melnik, the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, he had a response which was rather shorter in 3 words. The translation into English is "go to hell." Perhaps that's a more polite translation than might possibly be done. But I just want to clear up just so that we understand, because of course you're quite a well-known person in Germany. You will not be as well-known in Ireland. There are some voices in the West who essentially adopt what is very difficult not to call a pro-Russian position, leading even to the point that of disputing fairly basic facts. For a start, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has flat out denied that Russia even invaded Ukraine. But we have even some Western voices, we don't have to speculate about their motivation, who are saying that, for example, the Bucha massacre was staged or was a fake or was conducted, in fact, by Ukrainians, and who have disputed very basic details of the war. Do I take it that neither you nor, as far as you know, any of the other signatories of this letter have any truck with that type of argument?
If you look to the bunch of persons that signed this letter or wrote this letter, you see there is not even one person where you might say this is a friend of Putin. Mm-hmm. And in my perspective, I have some political enemies, so to say. This is Salvini, this is Le Pen, and some others. And these are exactly those figures that are friends with Putin. Why should I be clear, a friend of Putin?
to be clear, you are from the SDP, the German Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, effectively. Salvini and Le Pen and so forth are from the far right in Italy and France, and you're saying that they are not on the same side of politics as you are. Although in Ireland we have in particular 2 MEPs, Mick Wallace and Claire Daly, who are very much from the left and are perceived to have taken a very powerfully pro-Russian lines. Although they say that they condemn the Russian invasion, they call for the removal of all sanctions from Russia and instead calling for an arms embargo on Ukraine. So whether they say they support Putin or not, what they are calling for is unquestionably something that would benefit Putin. Is it possible that what you're calling for is to the benefit of Putin as well?
No, I don't think so. Look, I'm not of this region.
I accept that, absolutely. I accept that.
Spectrum. In fact, right-wing persons sometimes adopt a stance that is close to the Russian interests, and some very left-wing politicians too. Mm-hmm. I'm not very left-wing. So I was part of the Schröder government. This is more liberal social democratic position. And I was always skeptical about becoming too much dependent on Russian fuel, for example, Russian gas and Russian oil and so on and so forth. So let's let out this background. It's a systematic question. What should we do? What is good for mankind? What is good for the Ukraine persons? And the interesting point is that, for example, the president of the Ukraine some weeks ago said, well, we know that we will not be able to reconquer Crimea. This is what Zelensky said. And shortly after, he changed position. And the question is there some influence of Western countries that say, well, we are not interested in soon negotiations. We are much more interested in weakening Russia as a nuclear power and a big player in world politics. So continue that war. I hope that it is not the case, that the reason for changing the position of Zelensky is more of the inner debate in Ukraine. There are more nationalist positions and more liberal positions, and Zelensky is normally not on the right-wing nationalist position, but he is weak maybe in his position if they gather people opposing the politics of the president. So I'm not enough informed about these processes, but this can indeed become very dangerous. And in this context, only one sentence about Melnik. Melnik's political...
This is the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany.
ambassador in Germany, very present in the public debates. And his political idol is Stepan Bandera. And this is a Ukraine nationalist and also fascist who fought against Jews and fought against Polish people, saying they should not be able to live in the Ukraine. A person who has this political idol shouldn't be taken seriously in political debates.
Okay, I take on board what you're saying, and there is, of course, a broad spectrum of political opinion in Ukraine as there is in any other country. It is notable that the far right in Ukraine is particularly small and particularly weak. Most continental EU countries have parties that are far right or neo-fascist that score much more highly in their elections, notably Le Pen in France, Salvini in Italy, than the far right do or have done in recent elections in Ukraine. The far right party in Ukraine didn't even score enough in the elections to gain a single seat in the parliament there. But
that's true, but one should discriminate between parties, right-wing parties. These parties are quite weak in the Ukrainian parliament, and nationalist positions saying, for example, that we should include the NATO in this conflict, so the war should be extended to NATO states, and so on. So there are nationalist positions even in parties that are not right-wing.
That is correct. But one thing I just want to take up with you is that you're correct that there's the absolute technical position and there is the way that that precision is perceived. And I mentioned some far-left politicians who I accept that you are not associated with, and I'm not suggesting that you are. There are some far-left politicians and some far-right politicians whose views and whose speeches have been hugely celebrated in the pro-Putin media in Russia. That's the only media that exists in Russia. And their speeches are presented to the general Russian audience as the West coming round to Putin's point of view. And I actually keep quite a close eye on the content of Russian media because I think that gives us an insight into Mr. Putin's thinking. And it is undeniably the case that your letter was also reported in that theme. It was reported to Russians by Putin media as saying, see, the West is beginning to agree with us. It shows us how right we are. However, you didn't say precisely that. That is very unfortunate, isn't it?
Well, I'm happy. No, I'm really happy if this letter is presented to the Russian public. I'm not sure.
Of course, the content was not presented. Some
content, probably not the letter. Putin does not agree for the moment to a ceasefire. He seems not to be interested in negotiations because probably it is an illusionary stance because he thinks the war is going on very well. Some recent speech is going on as we planned. This is obviously not the case. This is an illusion. But if Putin accepts a ceasefire and negotiations, this is perfect. Then we reached our goal.
We have a phrase in English, that's easy for you to say. If you were Ukrainian and not German, so that's to say, if it was German states that were being given to Russia in order to buy peace, you might have a different point of view.
No, we had these situations also in Germany. For example, Saarland, as you might remember, belonged to France after the Second World War. And with a population that was mostly German-speaking. And then many years later, I think 10 years later, after the end of the Second World War,
1956.
A referendum showed that there is a majority for belonging to Germany. And then, without any conflict with France, it was decided like that. Why not going a similar...
I must answer. You say why not? Because in 1956, both Germany and France, West Germany as it was at the time, and France, had rational democratic governments. And I think is the fault and the flaw in your letter is that there is an assumption that Mr. Putin is either rational or democratic. And I think that the evidence is that neither of those is the case. And I just want to propose a model to you, which I've mentioned before on this podcast. And one model is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you have two powers who are in great conflict but don't particularly want war. And they manage, through negotiation, to secure something which might not have happened, peace. There was no nuclear war after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there was somewhat of a compromise on both sides. Russian missiles were withdrawn from Cuba, and also secretly, without much publicity, American missiles were withdrawn from very close to Soviet territory in Turkey. So that's one model where
this is
you
a
have
very good example.
Yes, no, but hold for 1 second. Hold for 1 second,
Yeah.
because I think the other model is the Munich Chamberlain Peace Conference model, whereby a supposed compromise, which was the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and Hitler was given the Sudetenland territories in Germany as a peace offering, supposedly to prevent war, after he had violated the Versailles Treaty several times previously, and it was hoped that giving him these lands would prevent war. And that was an entirely wrong thing to do, because it allowed him to essentially get more and more territory without even expending his military resources. Can you tell me, what's the evidence that we're in a Cuba Missile Crisis situation and not a Munich conference with Hitler situation?
Well, we are led astray a little by your question, but okay, let's go astray a bit. There are different historical examples that you can use as analogies, but analogies never are perfect identities. They are just different in different contexts. One analogy would be the beginning of the First World War, that nobody wanted a world war, but in the end, within some weeks, we ended there. So is this an example that could happen in the Ukraine? The German chancellor has this fear that it could happen if we aren't careful enough. A second example is the appeasement policy against Hitler. That was obviously wrong, but you have to be precise. Would in these days be the advice to let Austria fight against Germany? Probably not. And then the third example, very interesting example, is the Cuba Missile Crisis in '62. The Soviet Union was not a democratic state, as you know. It was sheer dictatorship, totalitarian rule in '62. Still, I would say.
But I don't want to stop you. But I just want to interrupt with one fact. They were not looking to conquer other nations. They were certainly looking to influence with socialism and so forth. But go ahead.
They wanted to extend the region of influence. Cuba was socialist country after the revolution, and they wanted an additional state that more or less is pro-Soviet Union oriented and is part of the military structure led by the Soviet Union. And the American president Kennedy, how do you say in English, waged nuclear war, because he wanted to inhibit that development.
He threatened nuclear war.
He threatened with nuclear weapons to react, or at least to allow for an escalation of nuclear weapons. And then, as you described perfectly well, then this was the compromise they took. So the interesting message of this is you can negotiate even with a non-democratic state, and it can result in some kind of interaction that avoids war in the future. This was the main message in '62. Be careful with the stability. Be careful with the more or less stable military and security structure that was developed. Don't try to overwhelm the other. So, and this was the parity idea, and then all these negotiations going on, START contract and other contracts for reducing nuclear
treaties. Yes,
treaties. Sorry, and so I would say in that sense there is an analogy. Russia is, for the moment, not a democracy. It's a dictatorship, and developing even totalitarian properties in the meantime. Ukraine is a democracy, but not a very well-developed democracy. If you look to the international rankings, Ukraine is on place 96, I think, and Russia is 120 or 126. So we don't have a conflict between a fully developed democratic state with liberal rights and no corruption and no problems with minorities on the one hand, and and a dictatorship on the other. We have two states that are, one is probably, hopefully, on the way to democracy, Ukraine, we will see in the future. And the other is, as it seems for the moment, on the way to dictatorship, totalitarian elements. But still, we have to avoid war. And we have to end this war as soon as possible.
I offered you those two analogies because I thought that perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis was a good model for how you see that. And I think you've confirmed that that's the case.
Okay, I misunderstood you. Yeah.
Not at all.
Okay,
No,
perfect.
not at all. But what I want just to point out and maybe get you to comment on is that the analogy, I think, breaks down because Russia has already invaded Ukraine and has already committed massacres, targeted civilians. And there is a phrase which I borrow from women who campaign on the topic of domestic violence. Then when a partner who is threatening domestic violence says something, threatens something, says, I'm going to kill you, the advice is to believe them. And I just want to point you to an article which I'm sure you're aware of on RIA Novosti, which is the Russian state news agency. So it's not just a TV station or a website that's under the influence of Putin. It's actually state-owned and state-directed. And a month before you posted your letter, there is an article on this website, which is still live, which is explicitly calling for the complete destruction of the Ukrainian nation in terms of people and in terms of culture and in terms of international existence. They explicitly say that they want the entire Ukrainian intellectual class and the military, quote, liquidated. That means murdered. And that the whole population of Ukraine deserve to suffer decades of forced re-education for the supposed crime of supposedly allowing a Nazi government to take over Ukraine.
Exactly.
They explicitly say, no, I want to get, because this is a very important article and this comes from the heart of the Kremlin. They explicitly say that they want to wipe out the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. And if you see what is happening, for example, in the Bucha massacre, so we have some areas of Ukraine, especially in the north, that were under Russian occupation and the Ukrainian forces managed to push Ukrainian troops out. It is clear that there were a huge number of murders of civilians, particularly targeting the intellectual people, which would mean the mayor of the town, which would mean anybody who teachers and university professors, people perhaps like yourself. There are at least, this figure is perhaps changing, but the most recent figure I read was about 170 cultural sites in Ukraine of no military value whatsoever, which have been destroyed by Russian bombing, apparently deliberately. And my question, and I am coming to a question, my question for you is this, is to say, how much of Ukraine can be expected to suffer this and have them not fight back?
All what you say speaks in favor of a ceasefire and an ending of that war immediately. All what you say, if this war is continued, so almost all military experts say from day to day, from week to week, the Ukraine becomes weaker in that conflict. And if it continues for months, maybe with the interest that this may weaken in the long term Russia, that ends in many additional losses and additional dead persons on the Ukrainian side, also on the Russian side.
No, pause for that. Pause. No, just 1 second. No, I just have to say, you say that it allows, if the Russians have a stated aim of murdering everyone who they classify as an intellectual, are you sure that any form of ceasefire or surrender or partial surrender on the part of the Ukrainians would avoid those murders?
Look, I have given many interviews from the beginning. You can't know these all also because they are in German. And from the beginning, I said, we have to do everything to avoid that there will be I use the German term, Diktatfrieden of Putin, though a peace that is dictated by Putin on his terms. This has to be avoided. I even said in another interview, it's good at the beginning of the conflict that the war continues, that the war is not over, as some expected, within 48 hours or so. So don't misunderstand me. It was right to give subsidies, military means, and so on to the Ukraine in order to avoid a Diktatfrieden of Putin. So
yes.
A peace dictated
an
by
imposed
Putin
peace,
on
I
his
think is the word you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. What's the term?
An imposed peace.
Imposed peace. Fine. Diktatfrieden I find nicer.
Okay.
But okay. Imposed peace. And now we are in a situation in which every additional day costs many, many lives on both sides, but mostly on the Ukrainian side probably, and costs much more in the global perspective. So we have hunger problems, as I said before. And so a ceasefire would destroy that idea, the idea of Putin, or at least some in his surroundings, that say, well, the Ukraine has to be wiped out. So I don't understand why exactly this atrocity speaks against the ceasefire.
And can you say, I mean, you accepted, I think, that Putin is not interested in a ceasefire, and I think you're correct in that. So for as long as Putin has no interest in a ceasefire, what is the moral thing to do in terms of the West's, Germany in your case, but the West in general, support for Ukraine?
To help the Ukraine to defend itself, but not to give food for the illusion that the Ukraine could win over a nuclear superpower.
Okay. We mentioned, and we spoke a little bit earlier about people on the extreme right and on the extreme left who have a curious amount of support for a position that is very close to what Putin says. And I don't suspect you, or any Western, mainstream Western politicians of being associated with that. But when you were a minister in the government, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor in Germany was Gerhard Schröder. And interestingly, François Fillon, I think overlapping somewhat, was the Prime Minister in France. Both of them were later hired effectively by Putin to make very large amounts of money working for Gazprom. Gazprom is entirely a creature of the Kremlin. It is completely controlled by the Kremlin. It's a source of an enormous amount of money. It's the company that exports gas to the West. Mr. Fillon and your previous boss, Gerhard Schröder, had absolutely no expertise in gas or in pipelines or anything like that. It is blindingly obvious, isn't it, that Gazprom was being used to buy influence?
Yeah, probably. I think it is a big mistake by Gerhard Schröder. He was a good chancellor. He avoided the second Iraq war, or the participation of Germany in the second Iraq war. And he did other things very, very good for the country. But this is a big personal mistake. I said that from the beginning. And I think as a former chancellor, you should never become a dependent of another country. There's also a British politician, as far as I'm informed, that.
Well, we have a mostly Irish audience, and I'm sure you would never confuse the two. But you are absolutely correct that the depth of Russian influence in British politics is hair-raising. But my point on that is this, that whatever you think about Mr. Putin, he is unquestionably an intelligent man in that he goes about what he wants to do in a way that's likely to be successful. It is unlikely that these are the only influence operations that he has had in Western European countries, France, Germany, and also Britain. And it is likely that some of them have been successful, isn't it?
Why not so very successful? So there was this combination of interests, Cambridge Analytica, as you remember, where Putin or some secret services tried to help Trump to win the election campaign in the US. And Facebook helped, knowingly or unknowingly. This is an interesting case, though there is always this this idea that one could split the West, split the European Union, help right-wing parties in order to get this done. I think this is an illusion by Putin. Putin might be intelligent, but he was not well informed about the Ukrainian situation. He expected the Ukrainian population to be, to a good part, friendly towards the Russian invasion. This was obviously not the case. He helped nation building in the Ukraine.
Yes.
What he probably did not aim at. and so
nevertheless,
forth. So
it has been observed that these more than likely bots, almost certainly controlled from Russia, on the day of the invasion of Ukraine, there was an enormous drop in the activity promoting anti-vaccine and anti-mask messages, and the same accounts effectively altogether instantly switched to pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian content. We know in your country more than most that the anti-vax message has had a significant impact. It would be naive to think that the other messages pushed from Russia like that are not having an impact.
Well, maybe. I'm involved a little also in the social media, not very much, but as far as I see, the Ukrainian influence is much bigger there than the Russian.
In social media, Ukraine has been enormously successful. There's no question about that.
Seems to be run by chatbots. I think the Ukraine is quite successful.
It is possible that this is just organic content, that this is just people who are expressing their views online in a genuine way.
Yeah, maybe. The strange thing is that in the German population, if you look through certain findings, there is more or less half-half. So half are in favor of further helping military also by big weapons, the Ukraine, and the other half of the population is skeptical about it.
Germany is about split 50-50, as you're correct, but Germany is an outlier. 50-50. But you would accept Germany as an outlier in Europe.
Yeah, maybe, but I'm German, so I see the German situation, and the strange thing is, or interesting thing is, that this is not mirrored in the media. So the media are almost 100% for more military means for the Ukraine, no ceasefire, Ukrainian victory as a goal, and so on and so forth. Strangely enough, half of the population remains skeptical till now.
Okay, you're obviously a native German speaker, and I don't know if you had contact with East Germany, you might have done Russian in school somewhat the same way that Irish people do Irish in school. But on German tanks and missiles and aircraft, on Russian tanks and missiles and aircraft invading Ukraine, very often was graffitied a slogan by the Russian military members who were driving them, Na Berlinie, which means to Berlin. The reality is, if Russia can take Ukraine, they can take Estonia and Tallinn. And if they can take Estonia, they can take the other Baltics, and they can take Poland, and they can take Berlin. That's what's on their mind. Are you really relaxed about that?
No, I'm not relaxed. And this is one of the reasons why I'm in favor of a ceasefire. The Ukrainian military tells that they destroyed 700 tanks, Russian tanks, in the meantime. I don't know whether this is true, but let's think it is true. Germany, the German military, has only 200 and something tanks that can be used for the moment. They have some helicopters and so on and so forth. So the idea that especially came from the US and partly from Great Britain, that we have to give up the usual defense forces and change it into international intervention forces, destroyed the whole military means that Germany has. Therefore, it is highly dangerous to give all these means now to Ukraine or to the Balticum and other states.
You're saying you can't afford to give them away because you might need them.
We have nothing. We have, it's extremely, look, for example, during the time of Chancellor Willy Brandt.
1960s.
And he was for Ostpolitik, neue Ostpolitik. So the idea
just for the Irish listeners, that means a friendly relations with what was then East Germany and the whole Eastern Communist bloc.
Exactly, but the budget for the military was 3.6%. So, and we had a quite well-functioning military in Germany. And this has changed in the meantime under conservative rule, interestingly enough. exclusively conservative rule. And so Germany should be quite careful to have the means to defend itself.
You're saying that the conservative rule, the CDU, reduced the percentage of GDP that was spent on defense?
Yeah, much, to 1 point something.
Mm-hmm.
So Germany has to be very careful not to lose any strategic option if this situation escalates.
Dr. Julian Nida-Rümelin, Professor of Philosophy and Political Theory at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and a former Minister of State, as I said, under Gerhard Schröder. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Okay, William, so we've just wrapped up our interview with Julian Nida-Rümelin. Do you think he got anything right on the power of escalation issue?
I think maybe he did. I mean, obviously, his point of view in maybe Ireland and in a lot of circles is not very popular. That letter in Die Zeit was very criticised. But I think the one thing I'd have to agree with him on is that Russia does have what he calls the power of escalation there, that they can keep throwing a lot of weapons and military hardware and troops and eventually nuclear weapons, if they wanted to, at Ukraine. Whether they're going to do that or not is another question, and whether they can be maneuvered into a position where Putin declares victory, goes home and runs his own propaganda machine in Russia, telling everybody how successful he was while withdrawing. That's probably, a scenario that could happen. But I think the failure in what he's talking about is if you aim for a ceasefire now. A ceasefire is essentially starting negotiations. And if you're looking for a ceasefire, you have to be giving away something. And the Ukrainians would have to be giving away large swathes of their territory, which are now under Russian occupation. And by all accounts, there are gross human rights violations, torture, murder, rape going on there. They'd have to essentially say, OK, we're going to let you away with that. So I think that's a very weak position to be arguing on the part of Professor Nida-Rümelin.
Well, he does, I think, in the interview, argue that I suppose the West would negotiate with Putin. And you mentioned the word maneuver, but since the letter said ceasefire now, the immediacy of that request would undermine any effort to negotiate, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's blindingly obvious that even if he's coming from a good place and he has good intentions, it's really, really clear that what he is advocating is exactly the same as what known Russian assets such as RT and Sputnik, these propaganda outlets, are advocating. In other words, that Ukraine just give up fighting. And whatever Professor Nida-Rümelin and all the other people who signed this letter, whatever they were really thinking, whatever intention they had in their heart, there's no question that in the Kremlin they were celebrating when they saw that letter come out.
We have another guest on the other side of the issue on Thursday. That's Jessica Berlin. I guess she can tell us her thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, that's right. We're doing a kind of two this week because it's basically both sides of this, and I think it's an important issue. So we'll have that on Thursday.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, follow Julian Nida-Rümelin at Nida_Rümelin, the spelling is on the website, and get in touch if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. Thanks again to all the patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get a huge amount of money from it, like some podcasters that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting and some other small costs like that. We basically do the podcast for free, but if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the price of a pint or even just the price of an ice pop once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website, Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. On Thursday, I'll put up that interview with the German international relations expert Jessica Berlin. She takes a strongly different view to Julian Nida-Rümelin. And don't forget, we want your questions for the summer special question and answer podcast. You can email them to podcast@here'show.ie in audio or text format, or even easier, send a WhatsApp voice message to 086 606 9401. There's a link that you can tap on the website and on the Twitter bio to send you directly to a WhatsApp message. You don't even have to save the number. We'd love to hear from you. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.